You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome, everyone, to a webinar on Catholic novelists. The 5 Catholic novelists we have with us today all have one thing in common. They have all published a book through En Route Books and Media, a St. Louis-based Catholic publishing house that was formed back in 2014 by me, Sebastian Mathud, and Ronda, Chervin, who is one of our novelists here with us today. One of the genres that most delights me is this genre you're about to hear today on Catholic novels and on imaginative literature and how it provides an important link between our material and spiritual worlds. So with that, I ask Ronda Chervin if she would lead us in a short prayer.
Dear God, our Father, I believe that many of us love fiction because life itself is more like a story than a syllogism or a tract. So we are so grateful that you have given us the gift to write fiction since we love fiction so much. And we pray that our fiction may be such as to glorify you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ronda. So we'll begin our show. I'll introduce briefly the names of the 5 novelists now. So our 5 novelists today are Linda Blosser-Medley, Grace Bourget, Thom Brucie, Ronda Chervin, and David Ross. We'll begin with Linda Blosser-Medley, who's a wife and mother who lives in a small town in northern Illinois. She works at the elementary school and is a volunteer catechist at St. Mary Church. With that, I ask Linda, take it away.
Hello. Many years ago, I was looking for Christian romance novels to read, and I found some by a Protestant author that were pretty good. They were about a woman from the Bible, or women from the Bible, I should say. The author took a story from the Bible and expanded upon it to make it come to life. And I really enjoyed reading her stories. And when I read them, I would pick up the Bible and read that version and compare what she had written. One of the stories that she wrote was about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And a couple of pages into the story, after the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, asking her to be the mother of God, Mary had dark thoughts. That made me really angry. I couldn't imagine that after an angel sent to Mary from God, himself asking her to carry his son would make her have dark thoughts. I put the book down and could no longer read it. I couldn't read another word she wrote. And it was at that moment I was compelled to write the story. And I call it the Catholic version. And even though I love to read, I've never had any desire to write a book. I used to marvel at the imagination it took to compose a book, and I knew I would be more like short and to the point sort of writer. So for me to feel compelled to write a story of the life of Mary, it was most definitely divinely inspired. So guided by the Holy Spirit, I started out with a notebook and a pencil. I took parts from the Bible, combined them, and expanded upon them. I did a lot of research about what life was like at the time of Jesus and thought about all the things that I learned through the years and began to write. Ideas would pop into my head after I would hear something in church, or I would watch something on EWTN, or read something religious. And one day in the summertime, I had a fever and I was lying in bed, but I was still awake when the birth of Jesus was given to me in a persistent thought. It was repeated to me continuously. And then I decided, well, I better grab my notebook and write it down. And so I did. As I prayed the rosary every day, I would picture what would have been happening during each mystery. I did a lot of research to make it as realistic as I possibly could. And it also helped that I'm a mother and could look at Mary's life through the eyes of a mother, especially during the crucifixion. That part has brought many to tears because I get really descriptive and bring out the feelings of what I felt Mary would have felt at that time as well. While I was typing for my notes, I realized that I had written a lot of contractions because, like I said, I'm not a writer. Well, so I took them all out and continued to wonder why God wanted me to write this book. One of my favorite parts of the story is Mary and Joseph's wedding, where I describe their attire. And here's a little excerpt from that part. When Joseph stood next to Mary, together they resembled the earth and sky. Where he was the solid ground and stability of the family, she was the elements that kept them nourished. One could not exist without the other. And this is how I feel marriage should be for all of us. I feel that we should complement one another. Men have their strengths and women have their strengths. And my daughter's favorite part is when the Magi came to visit Jesus. I get kind of descriptive about the food and things, and she really enjoyed that part. At the wedding of Cana, I explained how Mary found out that there was no wine left and had Jesus take care of the situation. So somehow I was able to add stories inside of the story to connect with the main story, showing that even strangers can become like family. People were attracted to the Holy Family without really knowing why, just that they were humble people and cared deeply for others. And here's another excerpt from just after Jesus died on the cross. And I'm not sure how this came to me, but it just seemed very fitting. The rain came from the tears of multitude of angels, the wind from their wings beating as they cried out in sorrow, the earthquake from God's own fist striking the earth in grief for his beloved Son. I would think that God would have been very angry and upset at what was done to his Son, even though he was sent here for that purpose. I don't see how God could have just been, like looking down, smiling upon that scene. And it took about 7 years for me to complete writing. And I combined truth with fiction using the Gospels so that the story of Mary's life flowed with what was in the Bible. For instance, when the Magi came to see Jesus, it had to have taken place after the presentation in the temple and not at the manger like you see in the creches. According to Jewish law at that time, women had to wait 40 days after giving birth to enter the temple. So after the Magi visited, then Joseph had the dream and the Holy Family fled to Egypt. I handed out copies of the manuscript to many of my relatives and friends, hoping to get feedback on the story and receive a lot of helpful advice. I also did a lot of praying and told God that if he wanted me to write this book, then he had to help me get it published. I left it all in God's hands. And he definitely took care of me and this book. I chose the title, A Sword Will Pierce, because I wanted the book to appeal to everyone, not just Catholics. And I've had several non-Catholic friends read it, and they told me they loved the story. My love for Mary and the Holy Family has intensified through this experience. I've always held the Mother of Jesus in high esteem, and it hurts me when I hear people say that she was just another woman. Because that just another woman could not carry God in her womb. I want people to see that Mary kept close to God, remained sinless, and never hesitated to do his will. They need to see that Mary was very devoted to God throughout her entire life, and that she was made specifically for her role in our salvation. She was not an ordinary person, but an extraordinary woman mother, and disciple, and that non-Catholics should love her too. And that's my story.
Thank you, Linda. So our next novelist is Grace Bourget. She is the author of Veil of Hope. Grace is an aspiring fashion designer who loves the Latin Mass, spending time with family and friends, and bringing fantasy to life through her hobbies, including co-producing with Chantal Lafortune the Song of Elbereth for WCAT Radio, and the writing of a space trilogy entitled Ransom, Shadow of an Empire, which is forthcoming by En route Books and Media in early 2023. Grace, it's all yours.
Thank you. So for me, I was inspired to write this story when I first watched. I don't think I watched the whole movie, but it was the 1959 Ben-Hur, when I first saw the scene with the leper camp. I started getting this idea about a story similar to Ben-Hur, where he's searching for his sister. But I didn't have a purpose for it. So when I first wrote it, it wasn't all that good. I wrote it back in 2016, I think. And then I rewrote it in early 2022. I found that I needed to write more on the despair and hope that I had slightly picked up on in the original version. I've always struggled with hope and trust myself, being prone to fear and despair, especially in our modern society. I put much of my own experiences with this into the character of Paul, who is the main character in Veil of Hope. And I hope it will help anyone who has similar trials. I also wanted to show the love, mercy, and patience of God, just as he's been with me. I'm still prone to fear and despair, but working with Paul has helped me greatly, so I hope it will be the same for others. I also wanted to introduce my readers to a lesser-known Spanish miraculous image of Mary and Our Lady of the Forsaken. Her story began in 1409 in Lent, when a priest saved a mentally ill man from lynching. The priest was inspired to start a hospice for the mentally ill under the title of Our Lady of the Innocents. In 1419, a brotherhood was started to take care of them, which soon expanded to include orphans and homeless as well, and the patroness was renamed Our Lady of the Forsaken. They wanted to acquire a statue of the lady, of course. So when three men came seeking shelter, offering in exchange to carve such an image, they were overjoyed. But after 4 days with no sound coming from that room, the monks broke down the door and found that the image was miraculously completed. It's always been believed that the three men were angels, possibly the archangels. There have been various miracles of, including one where the statue moved to save an innocent man from his death sentence. So it seemed appropriate for a story about hope and despair. It's a bit tricky to find anything on the image, though, so I would recommend, I believe it's called Miraculous Images of Our Lady by Joan Carroll Cruz, if you want to get any more information on that. Another reason I had for writing it is that I want to create stories that Catholic girls will love. I've often gone looking for stories that are Catholic, because I've always been a bookworm. But I can never find anything that's perfect for what I want to read unless it's a spiritual book. So I wanted to try and fix that a little bit. One of my main goals, too, has always been to write pure Catholic romances to try and show how relationships should and could be, how good men can be and how good women can be if they're close to God. And finally, I wanted to add another true story to the book. Rainbows were another real experience for me, the rainbows that were sent as a sign of hope to the characters. So I wanted to dedicate the story to my mom, who is responsible for most of what I've learned in the Catholic faith. As for what I've learned from writing it, besides spiritually, I did some study on the experience of lepers in medieval times. It was very fascinating in a sad way, because whenever anyone was diagnosed as being a leper, which could include any number of skin disorders, they would have a church ceremony that was basically like a funeral, but a living funeral to society. And I also researched what meals everyone ate and what fabrics and colors were worn by each class, what plant life existed and in what season, the social hierarchy, weather, geography. And while the only real location is Valencia in the book, the general landscape is based on an area in central southern Spain. As I said, I hope that it will bring hope to anyone who, like the character of Paul, struggles with sin and despair, and help anyone like Iria, who hides their past for fear of hurting others, or hides their pain from evil to save someone, some way to be able to trust, or like the character of Rodrigo with anger when God's justice and mercy seems not to be what we need. I hope it will help too with a love for Our Lady under her many titles and inspire an interest in all the hidden gems of her images given by God. I may write a sequel in the future, but I wouldn't expect it to be soon, as I've noticed that with sequels, they tend to lack the purpose that the original had. So I'm still waiting to find a purpose for it. And that's it.
Thank you, Grace. All right. Our third novelist is Thom Brucie, the author of Obsidian Mirth. Thom is professor of English at South Georgia State College, where he teaches both English and creative writing. He is also the author of another en route book entitled Children of Slate. Thom?
Well, thank you. Good morning. Nice to meet all you other authors. This is the cover. Can you see the cover of my book? Okay. I can't see what I'm doing here. Oh, there I am. Okay. But I'd like to start a little by explaining the metaphor that's sort of encompassed between the image and the title. I've had a number of people wonder what the heck it means. So you'll notice that the landscape is severe, and that there's an egg balanced precariously on the edge of a cliff that falls into doom. And there's a human figure encased within the egg. And the egg, of course, represents life, and so the human spirit, I hope, is invoked here. And the precariousness of the location of the egg and the symbolism of the image is that we humans are kind of balanced on the edge of between sanity and insanity, sort of like hope and despair a little bit, Grace. Because this book is about mental illness. The main character develops adult onset schizophrenia. So Obsidian Mirth, obsidian, of course, is a black stone-like quartz of a sort, but and it's very beautiful. You can chip it, and it's shiny and sparkly, and ancient tribes used it to make knives, and but also spears and arrows. So in its beauty, there's death and danger and kind of a dark side. No pun intended, it being a black composition. And mirth is humor, but in mythology, mirth is especially in the Gaelic tradition. Mirth was a humor sort of developed by the elves or the fairies, and they would pull a human woman into their group, and they made a delicious wine. And when the young woman, always a young virgin, drank the wine, it tasted delicious, but it made her exceedingly drunk. And then the fairies would compliment her, but all of the compliments were derogatory. And the young human woman did not realize she was being made fun of. And so mirth is really a dark humor, an insulting, degrading kind of humor. And so the intent of these two composite signs suggests mental illness. A psychologist told me once that a person who is mentally ill, especially a schizophrenic person, finds so much fear and loss in regular life that he or she creates a new world, one that's entirely in their imagination. And that's where things like seeing people that aren't there, delusions of grandeur, audio conversations that take place. All these things happen as a matter of both biology, sort of a dysfunction of the nerves. They don't actually break, but they don't work right. And the emotional need to get away from all the things that such an illness causes. And my first wife was a paranoid delusional schizophrenic. And in thinking about writing this book, there are some marvelous books about schizophrenia, some written by schizophrenics who reach moments of clarity from time to time. They're never permanent, and some are more clear than others. It's kind of like The Bell Jar, for example, or I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, or Nijinsky's Diary. But these are first person. This is what I experienced being schizophrenic and losing my mind. And I couldn't find very many descriptions or investigations of what happens to the intimate community that surrounds a person with an extreme mental illness. About 80% of families in the United States have experience with at least one member in their extended community with a mental illness. And mental illness, human beings, we're all connected, the web of life, husbands, fathers, mothers, we need one another. It's a basic component of the ability of human beings to love one another, is that we need one another. It's a genetic as well as an emotional drive. So the entanglements of normal human community are exacerbated when one of the members develops a serious illness and essentially discommunicates from normal life. They don't talk the same. They don't perceive reality the same. And in the case of severe mental illness, they completely separate from those they love. But those who love them don't separate. Their reality remains tender, desirous of healing, and very often with severe mental illnesses, there is no healing. So I wanted to write a book, and this book is written in first-person narrative form by Daniel, who's the husband of a woman, Chervin, who develops adult-onset schizophrenia. And their friends and their business associates and the consulting psychologist, and that becomes the web, the community of this particular family. And it of course, it explores the severity of the damage that happens to a person who loses his or her mind. But it also explores what happens beyond it. What happens to the person who loves a person who can't love back anymore? What happens to the person who loves someone who the other person doesn't even recognize that same personhood? There's a disintegration of not only the person who's ill, but of the relationships that surround and create and hold that community together. So that was the purpose that drove the dramatic moment that moved this story plot. And in the end, the character Daniel, the husband, he has to decide what's he going to do about this. My wife isn't my wife anymore, but she's still my wife legally. They made these vows. Let's love one another for the rest of our lives until we die, and we're going to do that whether we're rich or poor, whether we're sick or healthy, and those sorts of things. You wonder, well, where does sickness lay there? How healthy is healthy, and if there's sickness, we can go ahead and get divorced. Church has a way of saying, sometimes you can disassemble a marriage if there's maybe reasons. Certainly the law, it's simple in American law to get divorced. You just don't have to like each other anymore. You can say, well, yeah, we're out here, we're going to do something else. But the depth of meaning of marriage vows, Daniel, he's not sure that they're so simple. And he has to confront the cultural pressure of the medical community and the family and the friendship that say, look, she's gone. She's not the person you married. Go get divorced. It's not a big deal. Get on with your life. And he has to struggle with, what do the marriage vows really mean what we say when we say them? And how do I do that? He says, what if I'm going to stay with her? How the heck am I going to do it? I need love and I want love. And so there's this pull of desire that's oppositional to reality. And of course, the only way to subsume that kind of complexity is to allow some sense of the divine to intervene in not only the thought process, but the actualization of intent. And so in the end, he has to struggle with how is he going to manage. And so I'd like to take a little lead from Grace and Linda and read just a moment in the book, a small section in the first chapter that introduced the theme, essentially, of the complexity of the novel, but also might be a nice place for me to end to sort of display what the conundrum is and what can he do about it. So this is just a little bit, if I may. So it's a description of love and sort of a definition. So love is not 50-50 or 60-40 or 80-20. It is not even 100-100. Love is 100-0. When a man loves, he gives everything he's got, and he expects nothing in return. He loves unequivocally because he loves. Love is love. That's it. And when a man loves a woman, he loves her. 100%. Nothing less. Anything less is not love. It's something else. It could be almost love, or maybe great like, or even something such as admiration. But real love is real love, and it's all the way. It's indomitable, and it's lifelong. And love binds with a delicate strand. Any man who truly loves a woman can hope she loves him in return, but he cannot require it. And it doesn't always work out that way. And when it doesn't, then what? Thank you.
Thank you, Thom.
You're welcome. That's a pleasure.
Next is Ronda Chervin, the author of The Messiah of the Metro Cafe, who's professor of philosophy, widow, grandmother, great-grandmother, and co-founder of En route Books and Media. She's the author of numerous books about Catholic living, about a dozen of which have been published by En route, and she presents on EWTN and on Catholic Radio. Were I to list all of Ronda's accomplishments, there would not be enough books in the world to fill them. Rhonda, take it away.
Oh, thank you. Well, okay, I want to talk about, I've written many, many books. Most of them are not fiction. I tried writing quite a number of fiction books, including some with pseudonyms that are on Sebastian's en route books list. For instance, I wrote one with a pseudonym called The Sisters Karamazov, and we thought just the title would sell it. It didn't. But anyhow, so I've written quite a number of fiction books, and I love writing fiction. And this one, the latest one, The Messiah of the Metro Cafe, came about in this unusual manner. I happen to have a grandson who looks just like Jesus in The Passion, the famous movie, The Passion. And he looks so much like Jesus in The Passion that when he was in high school, the other kids called him Jesus. And on Christmas, they sang happy birthday to him. So it was quite a thing. Now, he didn't have the life of Jesus. He was a Catholic at that time. But then he left the church and eventually became, now presently in his 30s, he's a sort of New Age Jew. Okay. But he still looks like Jesus. So I happened to be visiting him and just sitting next to him and staring at this face that was just like Mel Gibson's, the Jim Caviezel in The Passion. I just got this feeling, I've got to write a little fictional novella about this grandson. And it wrote itself in such a way that I was able to write the whole little book in a couple of months, and Sebastian liked it so much he published it immediately. So I want you to focus on the picture first of him. And this one I like even better, that's on the back. If you could see it, you'll see why I think he looks like Jim Caviezel in The Passion. Okay. And he liked the book, actually, even though he's a New Age Jew. So this is the theme of the book, The Messiah of the Metro Cafe. This is the plot. I have a cafe near the beach in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area. It's near the beach, this cafe, and it's a chain called the Metro Cafes. And it happens that it's right near a Catholic seminary. Now, I taught in seminaries for years, so I'm very familiar with the way seminarians are and what seminaries are like. So in this case, okay, seminarians begin to feel like they just got to get out of the seminary sometimes. So for a while at one seminary I was in, they would go out to bars in the evening. Well, that's very bad for the reputation of the seminary, needless to say. So they were forced never to go out to a bar. So in my fictional account, because they can't go to bars, but they're allowed to go to this cafe, like a, cappuccino, cafe latte place. And at this cafe, they happen to meet our hero. And our hero is this New Age Jew, and he's a lifeguard at the beach right across from the cafe. But he spends his spare time in the evening when there are very few people at the beach, and he has a substitute take care of his lifeguard duties at the beach. He sits around this cafe, and because he looks just like Jesus, he attracts people to the cafe. And then when he attracts these people, including the seminarians, so he winds up where once a week, the seminarians, a group of seminarians, sits and talks to him. Now, the seminarians want to evangelize this New Age Jew who looks like Jesus, but the rector is afraid maybe this New Age Jew will influence them instead, and he better check it out, but he doesn't want to go himself to check it out. So he sends a reporter from the Catholic paper, to interview this New Age Jew who seems to be like the Messiah of the Metro Cafe. That's the title, okay? Now, okay, so the key scene in the key thing involves, she gives the seminarians a group of questions to ask him in order to write this article. And then she gives them opportunities to evangelize this same New Age Jew by means of these questions. So after he asks a question, they give their input, see. So their input actually becomes a defense of the faith in disguise, where they're answering the type of things that he says. So I want to read you a little example from it. One of the questions is, who is God for you? And my Messiah of the Metro Cafe, Michael Kaufman, says, that's easy. God is all. So this happens to be the type of thing that I hate about New Age, because it's like God is all, yeah. So if God is all, etc. So then here's what I have. A seminarian sarcastically retorted, oh, you mean God is a mosquito? You mean God is S-H-I-T? So then he says, okay. Then one of the other seminarians says, that's not a good way to evangelize people, by being sarcastic. Okay. So then this is the way the seminarian puts it a second time, so it's not so sarcastic. He says, Michael, I can see why you would think that God is the ocean or the sun, as you like to say. But what about yucky things like mosquitoes or defecation? So then, the way he puts it is that he, the Messiah of the Metro Cafe, that he sees God in these things, including in himself. So when he says all is God, it's sort of like everything beautiful is filled with God, not this, false metaphysical way. But in any case, so the way the plot thickens is that there's suddenly a siren, and it looks as if someone's drowning on the beach. There's a police siren. So the Messiah of the Metro Cafe runs out. He has to run out if there's an emergency. And one of the seminarians rushes out, lays a crucifix on the presumably drowned man, and he revives. And so the Messiah of the Metro Cafe takes this in, and then in the next chapter, another person is drowning, and he tries to revive this person, and he can't. So he starts to get interested in the Catholic faith, because he has to realize he is not, if he was the Messiah, he could have resurrected this drowned person. So you get the idea. Okay, so it has a happy ending, and to my delight, members of my family who don't like my writings because they're former Catholics and they don't like my Catholic writings, they like this little novel, though. So I feel very happy about that, and I hope other people will too.
Thank you, Ronda. Last but certainly not least, for today's lineup is David Ross. David is the author of Goat Song and Other Stories. He was born in California, raised in Oregon, and lives in Florida. So the entire country is his gambit. He has a BA in history and an MA in philosophy. His writing spans journalism, satire, op-ed pieces, and peer-reviewed scholarly articles. David, it's all yours.
The book that I wrote is Goat Song and Other Stories. One of the main reasons I really wrote it is because I like ideas, I like concepts, and I really like exploring these. And since I tend to explore ideas and concepts from a philosophical standpoint, I wanted to explore more conceptual things through narrative. When you're dealing with philosophy, you're dealing a lot with arguments, you're dealing with premises, which are declarative sentences, and there's almost no space for narrative. But as Christians, or Jesus himself argued in parables, he argued with a kind of narrative. And what makes narrative, I think, persuasive is really dependent on whether people act and react in believable ways. And I think that's why Jesus's parables are so persuasive, is because people act and react in believable ways. And so what I wanted to do is take a couple of different ideas that have been going through my head, a couple of different themes. And here, I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but Ronda and I feel like have a lot of overlap, because one of the major themes in my book actually comes from the work of Dr. Peter Jones, who's doing a lot of work in this kind of new age neo-paganism mindset. And Dr. Jones makes this argument that there are basically only two religions, what he calls twoism and oneism, like the two and the one. And this new age mindset, which really isn't all that new. I mean, you can see it clearly, I think, in the Old Testament. This new age mindset is the merging of the two into one. This becomes a very important and unique aspect of it, that you take distinctions and you blur them. And so I'll give you two examples. One is that there is no longer creation and creator. Now, as Ronda even said, right, God is in everything. God is one. You have this kind of pantheism mindset, or a kind of animism mindset that God is the universe, or maybe that God is within the universe in various natural objects. Another example that I think is very important too is the blurring of genders. So there's no longer male and female, a distinction between the two. You start to have the merging of the two into one. So with these things in mind, I think you can see our culture itself is really being captured by this new age neo-paganism mindset. And Dr. Jones even shows, and the law of Moses shows, right? In the law of Moses, it was not permitted for a man to wear women's clothing. Dr. Peter Jones shows that shamans in ancient pagan times would actually wear women's clothing as they performed various rituals. So you really have this blurring of distinctions, the blurring of the two into one. And this becomes an important aspect of neo-paganism or a new age mindset. And so this becomes an important theme in the book, or really it's a novella of two short stories, but the one I want to focus on is Goat Song. That throughout the book, you have this merging of heaven and earth, of past and present and future. You have a merging of nature and technology. You just have the merging of everything into this one thing. And so that to me is an important discussion to be had, even from like an apologetic standpoint, because in terms of apologetics, there are a lot of people doing works against atheism and agnosticism, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot going on in terms of how do we answer neo-paganism in the New Age mindset. So that was an important theme that I really wanted to explore in my book. And I don't think it's new either. I mean, this merging of the two into one it goes back even to like William Blake, right? The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So one thing I really tried to zero in on is that in paganism, an essential aspect of it is using technology to make new gods. And so you have craftsmen who are using technology or various tools to create new gods. And so, I mean, really the question I asked myself is what would happen if people had the technology to do the things they wanted to do? What would happen if people had the technology to make their own gods, to blur all distinctions? And so that, I think, is really what unfolds in a slow, dramatic way throughout this novella that is Goat Song. So that's one of the big themes that I really wanted to explore. The other is tragedy itself, because the very term Goat Song, it comes from the Greek, and it is literally, it's the Greek word for tragedy. The Greek word for tragedy is this kind of hyphenated merging of the term of goat and song. And there's a lot of discussion about where it comes from. I'm not sure any one person knows for certain. So I explored what I think are some tragic things that pertain to being human. One of them is just that as a human being, we must experience life inside of time. And I think one of the tragedies of that is that we are overcome before we realize it. We have a very difficult time kind of keeping up with what's going on in life. And it's often not until afterward, till we're reflecting on what has happened, that we can analyze something and just see it for what it is. I mean, for example, like falling in love. You experience this as you go along in life, and it's really only when you are overcome and it has overwhelmed you, do you begin to admit to yourself, oh yes, like I genuinely love this person. Another one might be, for example, like conversion. People experience various conversions. It's not until we admit to ourselves that it has already happened that we begin to realize, like, I have been converted. And so there is, I think, a kind of tragedy in that we can't see things as they're happening. And it's really not until it's too late, or it's already overcome us or overwhelmed us in some way, that can we see what has finally happened. It really takes it for it to already happen in order for us to be able to see that it has happened or what is happening. So this sense of tragedy, I think, is really one of the important themes in this book, this tragedy of being overwhelmed. And so what the book really is about this guy who's he's a newspaper reporter who learns about this kind of clandestine, once every number of decades play that people put on. And so they put on this great big play. It's one of those things you have to be invited to. You can't find out about it. And so he gets an invitation to go to this play, and sort of everything kind of that I've been describing, all these concepts and ideas and themes really take place from him going to experience this play. And the play is really put on by people who see the play as a kind of religion, so I really tried to give it what I consider to be a sort of pagan flavor, where the people put on the play with a lot of ulterior motives in mind. So that to me is sort of the gist of this novella, the gist of what I'm trying to get across, what I'm trying to explore, and these very tragic aspects. And of course, I think one of the ultimate tragedy being this desire to make our own gods. How this plays out, I think, through, especially through technology, through how we understand technology, through our relationship to technology, that we've got it ingrained into us that we can surpass our own humanity by the use of technology. And I don't think that's a new thing. I don't think that's merely computers and smartphones. I think people have been doing that for a long time, and it's no coincidence that using technology to create gods has been an essential part of pagan history. So in this book, really one of the things I hope people will take away from it is a use of the deep imagination, being able to learn how to imagine deeply. Because one of my goals in writing this book was to take techniques I had learned in college. I had taken like story writing classes, like playwriting and screenwriting, and learning how to imagine a story and to see it unfold in a movie-like fashion in your own imagination. And I hope that when people read it, that they themselves will have their imaginations provoked. And maybe it says something more about me because of how I grew up. I grew up with kids' TV shows telling me that your imagination is the most important thing. But there, to me, seems to be something very good about being able to cultivate and use and have a kind of deep imagination. And so I hope that this is able to provoke that in some sense, as well as to open up discussions, right? Discussions about these things. Narrative has a funny way of opening up a discussion about concepts, about ideas that maybe a direct argument is too raw for some people to be able to deal with. And so that's kind of Goat Song in a nutshell. I really tried to write a novella, something that someone could sit down and enjoy within a day, because I personally enjoy those kinds of things. I remember reading like A Clockwork Orange and being able to enjoy it in one day from beginning to end. And it's longer than a short story, but it's enough that you feel like you really got something out of it. So that was my goal in writing it. That's Goat Song. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. So those are the introductions to our 5 books. I'll start with a leader question for David, just to follow up on the rest of your book. It's Goat Song and Other Stories. So you've got 2 other stories in there. Do they have any relationship to Goat Song or to one another?
They do not have direct relationships, no. It's more, one of them is a shorter story in terms of short story. And that is sort of exploring this theme of what happens when you try to close yourself off to the world and the world breaks through. So it's sort of about a recluse who kind of has a supernatural experience break into his home. And what begins to happen is there's a hole in the ground in his backyard. And as you go throughout the story, the chapters are listed by the size of the hole. And so the hole just gets larger and larger and larger until other things start happening. The story after that is actually the oldest, the one I wrote the longest ago, I guess you'd say. And that came at a time when I was actually very sick of academics. And so I trained as a bread baker to learn to do something with my hands. And I was working for a small business. And I just asked the question, what would happen if there were on a global level sanctions placed on a small business? Like, what would have to have happened on a global scale in order for one small business in America to have, like, sanctions placed by the United Nations? And so that's kind of where that story came from.
We sort of experienced that already during COVID.
Yes, we did.
We have a question from our audience. For Thom, have you explored the relationship between mental illness and mystical experiences? Are they related, or do the distinctions need to be brought out in Catholic literature? What do you think?
I don't think that there is a causal relationship between mental illness and mysticism, except perhaps in a misunderstanding of the literature between the two. Remember, when I was finishing up the first book and struggling with this one, I wrote Dr. Moffat a text or an email, and I told him I had just finished reading this book I discovered called The Cloud of Unknowing, and I didn't like it because in that book there's this kind of sense, if you really want to be a mystic, you have to let go of all of your senses and go into this cloud of unknowing. And I told Dr. Moffat, no, I'm a sensitive man. I need my five senses, and my writing needs five senses. You got to bring your emotion and your descriptors from the senses. And he was very kind and of course erudite, and said, well, maybe later, you'll read it again and get something out of it. And not too long after that, when I was struggling with how is Daniel going to sort of mix the horrible feelings he has at the loss of his wife and the need to still love her, because you're not the same thing when somebody's mentally ill. And so I was reading Thomas Merton on contemplation, and in the introduction, it makes note that some of what we have to do to recognize how the Lord works us into meditation rather than something we can actually do, it's similar to those ideas expressed in The Cloud of Unknowing. And of course, at that particular moment, I thought I'd better send an email of apology to Dr. Mahfoud, but I never did, but I shall apologize now. But see, mental illness is a loss of contact with reality. Schizophrenia, at least. Severe schizophrenic break never heals. And the mystical experience is, my limited exploration of that, and I caution myself about speaking too much of it and to it. It is a divinely guided consummation of the Holy Spirit and our souls, a completion, one might say, of who God intended us to become. Whereas mental illness is a psychic split that disconnects that person from everything we know or understand or think we know and understand about what it means to be human. They lose that. That's the sad loss. One time in my life before she died, she said, we were talking, and she said, sometimes I think I'm not insane anymore. And probably was the saddest moment I ever had with her regarding the loss of her personhood. And with a mystical connection, I mean, it's like, I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody here, but that's all. That is a moment, a tiny sliver of moment in time of an experience with a timeless being who's not bound by time or space. So I hope that helps you, and you write your novel now, or send the question in.
Thank you, Thom.
Yeah.
Well, I've got another one for you, Thom, but I'm going to wait a moment to ask it. I want to bounce over to Linda real quick. So, Linda, in your book, you offer a reason for the host at Cana running out of wine for the wedding guests. Could you share that reason and talk about why it was helpful to explore possible reasons for unanswered scriptural questions like the one you described?
Well, Mary gets to the wedding before Jesus comes, because he had been out in the desert and brought some of his disciples with him. And she runs into a servant girl that is crying. And the servant girl had spent time with the chief steward, and he had used the money that he was supposed to buy the wine with to have an affair with her. And she found out that he was married, and she became pregnant. And so it's kind of like a backstory of, okay, because, it was a really elaborate wedding, and there should have been no reason why they would have ran out of wine, because they should have been prepared for that, because weddings lasted about 7 days in that time. And so Mary went to Jesus, and she explained to him what happened. And then he took care of the wine, as in the Bible. So I put the parts of the Bible in along with the backstory. And so, because at that time, women that were with child that were not married would have been stoned, Mary asked Jesus if they could take her with them and basically make her part of the family. So yeah, it was kind of, I don't know, like I said, it was all divinely inspired. So, but that's kind of the backstory.
I wonder if Mary, if being in the presence of Christ is a mystical experience, if Mary was always experiencing a mystical experience, or whether or not she had time for the mundanities of everyday life. Yeah,
throughout their lives, there were mystical things that happened, and because Mary knew, who Jesus was, but they tried not to let other people know. Basically, didn't want to go around saying, well, Jesus is the Son of God. But in their actions and some of the things that happen throughout the story prove that, yes, there were a lot of mystical things that did happen in their lives, not just after Jesus, came out and started preaching. And so...
Well, your book provides a lot of very reasonable and practical and believable examples of the kinds of things that would have been in the lives of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as they progressed, through them into Christ's ministry and then through his crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
Then talking about that kind of relationship between the imaginative worlds in the real worlds. I have a question for Grace. Grace, you've produced 2 works that take as their themes the worlds created by Tolkien and Lewis. Would you say something about each and talk a bit about why their worlds are useful for exploration when your own work, Veil of Hope, demonstrates that you can create worlds of your own?
Okay, so the first was the Song of Elbereth, which I wrote as a short story when I was taking Dr. Mahfoud's Tolkien class, Tolkien and Lewis it was. So I wanted to explore, I always wondered how it was that Galadriel could obtain starlight to give to Frodo in the light of Erendil. So I decided to answer that question, created my own characters as well as using some of the originals to try and explain that a little bit. And then we turned that into a radio play for WCAT Radio, which was a very fun experience to do with my friends. And then the second work.
Well, if before you jump onto the second work, if you don't mind, I can show the Song of Elbereth. Here it is for the audience. And you did this as a radio drama in 7 scenes.
Yes.
So it's here on WCAT Radio. You can find it on Spreaker, on iHeartRadio, or wherever, just by keying in the Song of Elbereth. Is there a particular scene or a particular idea within this that you would like to share?
Well, I guess again, it had a theme of hope, of being able to bring that light, with Elbreth being a figure of Our Lady, being able to obtain grace from her, basically, in obtaining the light of Erendil, which then, being given to Frodo, helped to end the reign of evil over Middle Earth. So that was important for me too, because I've experienced, of course, like spiritual struggles. So I usually put that into my stories to help.
Hope seems to be a theme in all of your work.
Yes.
How does it play out in Ransom?
In Ransom, I explore both relationships with love and the different types of slavery, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Like trying to break free of those chains and figuring out what is it that can break those chains for you and what that hope is.
Thank you. We may come back to that as we continue our discussion. Faith, hope, and love are the big three. And your focus on hope is an important focus. For Ronda, this is the first time you publicly revealed the authorship of Sisters Karamazov, after having remained hidden behind a pseudonym for so long. What prompted you to reveal this?
Oh, because I thought that the others on the panel would be amused by the title, that's all. No, the reason that I did it pseudonymously is it has a lot of things about my own personal family, and there are people in my family who objected fiercely to things I put about them in my autobiography. And so to avoid having a whole another decade of reproach from different family members, I decided to make their lives fictional and say it was written by Natalie Karamazov.
Well, the title certainly is provocative, Sisters Karamazov, patterned after the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. For Thom, Children of Slate is quite a different book from Obsidian Mirth. Would you talk about that? Do you see any connections psychologically, perhaps, between the two works?
I think there's this connection. In order to understand love, Daniel in Obsidian Mirth had to understand forgiveness as an aspect of his own healing. So he had to forgive Charlene, his wife. He had to forgive hurts. He had to forgive himself. And that, I think, is also somewhat of a pattern to maneuver into, some aspect of contemplative prayer, which eventually, when successful, connects us up to an unending, ever-expanding, explosive, ongoing lovingness of a divine creator, and that spark of connection. And in Children of Slate, my intent with that book is to explore the reality of miracle in contemporary culture. I do not believe that the age of miracle is gone. I think that, God acts within the physical realm in some manner. I'm not saying I know how. He doesn't explain that to me. Might not till I'm dead. But there's a decisive, powerful energy at work in all of our lives if we give it permission to reveal. And my suspicion is that God is miracle. Maybe we'll get rid of that all thing, and whatever he does, it's miraculous because it's God. And if we, you get into profound philosophical, theological nuances, and I don't want to do that. But the notion of miracle as a daily experience of God revealing himself to us and our recognition of that connection, I believe to be a valid position. And so in that sense, the miraculous is maybe evidence, for lack of a better word, that we're on the right track, right? That we're learning how to pray. We're learning what grace is and how to accept it. And the same thing happens in Obsidian Mirth, that Daniel eventually has to reach that moment, that climactic moment of, well, there's something greater at work here than just me and just Chervin. So in that sense, they're connected, but they're different topically. Yeah.
Well, then we have our full lineup. We have Linda as our author on faith. We have Grace as our author on hope. And we have you, Thom, as our author on love. A question for David. We have a lot of blurring of distinctions occurring in our society today. Consider, for instance, the transgender movement. Do you see Goat Song as a way to address particular social issues?
I mean, in typical philosophical fashion, I'm going to say it depends on how we define social issues. I don't necessarily mean it in the sense of social justice, but maybe in a sense of like culture, assumed beliefs, assumed behaviors, an assumed structure and worldview, a lens through which to interpret reality. And so in some sense, I do see it as trying to shine a spotlight on a cultural assumption for how the world must be, or the world can be, or what people would make the world if they had the opportunity and the power to make it that. So in part, I would see it as that. But I guess I would also, I personally find a lot of relief in studying history and in knowing that this isn't new. For me personally, I find that actually very comforting. And that's how I don't, freak out by watching the news or something like that. Because when you study history, you realize like people have always been people and they'll always be people. And if you look at it especially from a Christian perspective, you realize like Satan's not very clever. He's not very interesting. And he just kind of does the same things over and over and over again. And so I guess I would see it as a way to shine a spotlight on a cultural issue that should be taken seriously. And I think we should be prepared to argue, whether the argument is through narrative or whether the argument is through like philosophy or theology. We should be able to make a defense to these claims that are being made, these assumptions that are being made. But I don't necessarily mean it in the sense of like social justice. And that, I guess for me, it's more of a, what is culturally relevant. I would approach it more from that perspective, if that answers your question.
Sebastian, could I interject something? It just happens that because two of you have been wrote so much about Mary, and I'm very eager to read it, I have a little way of using Mary in an argument that I wanted to run by you. Okay, on the question of women priests, when people insist there should be women priests, what I say is, okay, suppose you were having a nativity play in your parish, and suppose Clark Gable happened to be in your parish. Would you put him in the role of Mary? See, so it makes people think. See, so, do we want a woman in the role of Jesus who was obviously a male? So I just thought I would just throw it out to you.
Linda, do you have a response to that?
Definitely would not be good to have a male portray Mary. I mean, there is definite roles of mothers compared to fathers. And I really know that you can't replace that. And Jesus bringing our salvation to us and having his apostles, and they were all male. And at that time, I don't want to say it was like male dominance, but the male led the role. Like they took care of the family, they took care of the situations. And like I explained with Joseph being the foundation, I feel that the male is the foundation, and the women are the elements that nourish the foundation. They take care of the things that, that are necessary and important for salvation, but the priesthood and our salvation, I think God directed it to be led by males. I mean, I don't know if anyone agrees with that, but that's how I feel.
Well, I do for sure. So no, that corroborates that literary way of putting it.
So we need Clark Gable as Joseph, is what we're saying.
Yes.
I think additionally what we're saying is that distinctions are important. And that happens to be the chief job of a philosopher, is to make distinctions, which also happens somewhat ironically, but not entirely, because one of the properties of the human person is risibility. It's also what makes philosophers natural-born comics. So Ronda, this could lead into your next book. Ronda has written a book called The Catholic Comic that is slated for publication by En route fairly quickly, maybe in the next few weeks. Ronda, would you like to talk about your upcoming book?
Okay, it's a short book. It's like a booklet. And I thought it might be nice to put together all sorts of Catholic jokes that Catholics tell that would, that of course priests like to use these at the beginning of homilies and things like that. But anyway, I thought I would just collect a whole bunch, including things from my own family that were funny. And let's see. Oh, one of them that I like very much that I'll just tell just so I can give you a laugh, because I like to make people laugh, is this one. After my husband died 30 years ago, he had been deathly ill with asthma attacks every night of our marriage. So he always expected to die first, especially since he was 20 years older. So he asked me just before he died, he said, "What are you going to do when I die, Rhonda?" And I said, "Oh, I'll become a nun." And he said, "You can't become a nun." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you are a nun." Anyway, so I eventually became a dedicated widow, which is like a consecrated widow. And I wear a blue denim dress, jumper, and I was wearing a little kerchief on my head. So I was walking with my daughter somewhere. I wanted her to come with me to the store. I was visiting her. And she said, "I won't go to the store with you because I don't want to look like the illegitimate child of a monkess." So there's a lot of humor in my family. So anyway, I have this favorite family jokes in the book, but I also have all sorts of other jokes that I just collected of different things that priests say and different wonderful stories. So coming out soon.
Thank you, Rhonda. I think that this has been an excellent opportunity for us to get together and for us to share our works with one another, and for us to allow our audiences to see what else is out there in the new and rising Catholic novelist authorship. En route Books and Media really hopes to create, because it has a special focus on publishing new Catholic voices, really hopes to create a new renaissance for the 21st century, filled with the kind of faith, hope, and love responses that are present already in our Catholic world and that are looking for ways to share that with others. So I want to thank all of you for contributing to the collection that En route Books and Media has published. And I'm looking forward to the new contributions you'll make not only with En route, but with other publishing houses in the Catholic world as time goes by. Grace, would you close us in prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We most humbly thank thee, O Lord, for all thy mercies and blessings bestowed upon us, and those which thou may choose to give to those who read our works. May they be sources of aid in drawing souls closer to thee. We particularly thank thee for all the graces we have received from thee this day, especially during this webinar. We thank thee for watching over us and preserving us for the sake of thy glory, and for favoring us with the gifts of our imagination and language. Let us never more be ungrateful to thee, our God, who art so good and gracious to us. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Thank you, Grace. Well, that's it. Everybody have a great remainder of our Advent season, and Merry Christmas to all.
Merry Christmas.
All right. God bless.
God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.